All right. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Nick Ewen. I'm a senior editor at The Points Guy, and I want to welcome you to this exciting travel trends webinar where we look at what to expect for travel in 2022. We have a jam-packed series of topics that we're going to be covering today: paths forward, trends, hot destinations, the state of the travel industry. Before we dive into all that, though, quickly, I want to review the logistics of the session today. As attendees, you all have joined today in listen-only mode, but we definitely do want to hear from you. So please feel free to submit any questions that you have for any of our panelists to the Q&A portion. We'll leave about 15 minutes at the end to answer as many questions as we have time to get to today. Some of the key things we're going to be talking about today include consumer behaviors, things like working remotely, flexibility, some of the pent-up demand we're seeing across the industry. We're going to be talking about destinations, demographics, and the world reopening. And we have an incredible group of panelists that are joining us today. So I'd like to introduce each one of them one at a time. They will join us here on the session, and then we'll dive in. So first and foremost, I would like to introduce Toby O'Rourke from KOA. Toby, if you will join us here, and please give the audience a very quick introduction. And then also, if you can look back on 2021, what was one kind of surprising thing in your consumers' behavior that you weren't really expecting?
Well, thanks, Nick, for having me and the whole team. My name's Toby O'Rourke. I'm president and CEO of Campgrounds of America. We're the world's largest network of privately owned campgrounds with 525 locations in the US and Canada. I think the biggest surprise for me was the fall. So coming off last year, we had a huge fall. We just saw business explode after Labor Day as people were traveling and schooling remotely, working and schooling remotely. And when we tried to budget for this year, we thought it would be comparable to last year, but we actually saw an explosion of growth even over last year. So currently we're 17% up in business since Labor Day over what we were last year, which was significantly higher than the year before. So that was a surprise for us. And we're just definitely seeing those trends continue into next year, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into all of those things. And our next guest is Jon Gray, the CEO of RVshare. So Jon, same thing. You could introduce yourself and then something from 2021 that really surprised you that you saw with your consumers and some of their behavior.
Sure. Hi, Nick. Thanks for hosting. So I'm Jon Gray. I run RVshare, and RVshare is the first and largest marketplace for RV rentals. What we do is we connect people who have RVs with people who are looking to go on an RV trip, similarly to a Vrbo or an Airbnb. And this year was another great year for us, building off of a really successful 2020 when people really switched to domestic and drive-to travel. Which were well positioned for RVing. And, we were right there with Toby where we were saying, well, what is this year going to bring? How are we going to top that growth? And we have, we've actually, continued to see the business accelerate and have delivered another really strong growth year on the back of what was a dynamic growth year last year. I'd say what is most surprising for me is as we look forward, our surveys are telling us that over half of travelers next year are targeting outdoor or national park destinations when they're planning their trips. So we're expecting another big year.
Yeah, I think outdoor destinations will be the name of the game. We have a lot to talk about today as we go through our session. And our next guest is Jeff Hurst from Expedia Brands. So Jeff, you'll join us and provide a quick introduction and what surprised you looking back at 2021?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Hurst, the Chief Operating Officer of Expedia Brands. We operate brands like Vrbo, Hotels.com, and of course, Expedia. I'm not sure I'm capable of being surprised anymore after 2020. And so I don't know that there's anything that was particularly notable. I think the thing I took comfort in was that the trends we saw in terms of a lot of people exploring new destinations and kind of a domestic drive-to held while the more traditional economy started to come back for travel. And so airfare picked back up and really a lot of urban destinations have accelerated again. The Las Vegases and Manhattans and, those destinations are coming back again in a way that I think is really healthy for people to be doing both the new and the prior in this new environment.
Yeah, I think the lack of surprise is probably something that we're all feeling these days. And our next guest is Alyssa Ravasio from Hipcamp, who I think is going to put me to shame for sure with her background compared to my blurred one here. But Alyssa, please provide a quick introduction and what surprised you about this past year.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Alyssa. I'm the founder and CEO of Hipcamp. We're the world's largest network of private lands that you can explore for outdoor recreation, including but not limited to camping, glamping, and RV stays. Similar to Jeff, hard to be surprised. I think, being a leader of especially a company in the outdoor or hospitality space right now is all about just riding the waves as they come. Similar to Toby and Jon have been, it's been a really strong year, much larger than last year. And so that's been exciting. I would say one of my favorite, this is a specific detail, but it's one of my favorite ones. We've seen a meaningful increase over 10% in terms of more people staying on weekdays. And that has been super cool for us to see, I think previously we really, as a company, were focused on the weekend warrior, these people who work until Friday at 5 and then jump in their car and zoom to where they can get to for their Friday, Saturday night stay. It's just been really exciting, I think, from a culture and human standpoint, to see people getting outside and enjoying nature on a Tuesday. I just think that's beautiful and something that's been really fun to watch.
Yeah, and that flexibility and remote, we're definitely going to be diving into today. And I want to introduce our last, certainly not least panelist for today, Laura Motta from Lonely Planet. So Laura, please join us and provide a quick introduction along with what surprised you looking back at 2021.
Hi, Nick. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm Laura Motta. I am the Senior Director of Content at Lonely Planet. I head up the digital editorial team here. And something that I think was not surprising, but something that I thought was kind of impressive is our audience, their willingness to get out there and travel amidst a lot of just difficult circumstances. I think that this was just like 2020, incredibly confusing year in terms of regulations, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing. And the thing that we saw over and over again was people's willingness to get out there, to buy their masks, to get their hand sanitizer in line, to figure out what was safe for them and for their families. So I'm continually impressed by the willingness of the audience to just get out there and go and see new things with a different set of parameters, certainly, than in the past. But people are going, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a great place to start, because we are seeing, of course, as more and more destinations open up, we're seeing cruises come back online. People are scratching that itch to get out there. And Jon, I want to start with you, because RVshare recently conducted a survey that found that nearly all of the respondents, were about 90%, said they are very likely or 100% likely to travel for leisure in 2022. So how are you at RVshare forecasting bookings and travel interest as we look ahead to next year?
Yeah, I think it's a great stat. People have been cooped up for a long time. We kind of said this last year going into 2021, and in many ways we're still in the same place due to restrictions and the pandemic and all these types of things. So we're planning for a full return to travel next year. That's what we have to plan for. If we see something different than that, then we'll react to that. But we're expecting a pretty full return to travel next year and continued strong growth in the outdoor travel category. What happened over the course of the pandemic is people cut back their expectations in terms of how ambitious their trips were. They went domestic and they went drive to. And what they found is that they had a better time than they thought they would. Actually, our average ratings are up year on year. So people who went on trips, sometimes midweek trips like Alyssa was talking about, sometimes, a bit longer trips than they've taken in the past, where they're blending work and leisure time together, and had a great time doing it. So we think that awareness that we've built will be reliable once other means of travel are back online. And this year was a good example of that. We saw airfare come back. We saw hotels come back, and we did not see really any material slowdown to the outdoor travel business. In fact, we saw it accelerate. So our expectation is that there will be more trips per traveler, and that travelers will be focused on value. And those things we think bode well for the outdoor travel industry and for RVshare specifically.
And when we think about outdoor travel as well as domestic, Alyssa, let me ask you how you are looking ahead at bookings for 2022, and if you see some of this, pent up demand just continuing to increase some of the interest in utilizing a service like Hipcamp.
Yeah, it's a great question and a complex one, I'd say, because we're also seeing a lot of shifts in just how people are planning for their trips. There seems to be a lot more confidence. People are feeling less worried that suddenly they're going to have to cancel everything and stay home. So that's another interesting trend that we're tracking. But looking to next year, we are seeing already, so for early next year, we already have twice as many bookings that are made and placed for the future as we did this time last year. So that's boding really well. Now, could it also just be people are more confident and more, confident about making a booking now versus, waiting till the last minute as we saw last year? Possibly, but that's what we're looking for. And for our company, that has huge implications because we actually have to go create the supply that people can book as those bookings start to come in. And so that's definitely shifting some gears internally about now let's go reach out to more landowners. Let's go make more partnerships with campgrounds. Toby would love to talk and really just find more places to get people outside.
And I'm glad you mentioned the idea of cancellations because Jeff, I want to come to you next. In 2020 for sure, and even for 2021, booking travel, spending money, putting that down on trips sometimes felt like a little bit of a gamble. You did have some revised cancellation policies, but then you saw this trend of trip stacking where people were planning multiple trips knowing that one of them might ultimately get canceled. So how have you seen an Expedia booking window shift and change? Do you see any of these changes continuing or even another shift as we move into 2022?
Yeah, I do think some of the trends will continue. In particular, as Alyssa mentioned in the camp space, I think in the whole home space, there's more demand than there is supply. And so people who've experienced it for the first time in the last couple of years, which are, a whole heck of a lot of people who are trying the category who may have been more loyal to a resort or a hotel occasion, have realized that it's a great category. You can explore the world and, have the privacy and space and amenities you want, but that there are so many people doing it, you actually have to book earlier to get what you want. And so in the home space, we're seeing people, already starting to book next summer and starting to stack up trips to where they might book their spring break and their summer at the same time, well ahead of what they might have done in 2019 and before, and feeling a lot more confident about it because the industry did adapt quite a bit in terms of offering more flexible cancellation and payment terms to make a lot of that possible. So we're really encouraged with where 22 is shaping up on that front.
Now, from a destination perspective, Laura, I'd love for you to weigh in here, specifically thinking about international destinations. We have seen countries opening up. We have seen shifting policies. So what do you foresee with travelers actually picking destinations to travel as we get into 2022? How do you think that's going to play a role in the continued recovery or rebound or expending this pent-up demand that has accumulated over the last nearly 2 years?
Yeah, I think because there were so many country and region closures as part of the first waves of the pandemic, I think, as you mentioned, we saw this huge surge in domestic travel. I think in terms of international destinations now, US travelers are looking at the destinations that are less volatile in terms of their opening and closing. So we've seen a lot of travelers, for example, heading to the Caribbean. So you're looking at shorter flights, you're looking at countries that are offering a lot of options in terms of, and a lot of flexibility in terms of booking and availability. And also too, they're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to comply with testing and vaccine requirements. So that part of the world has been very, very popular. And the thing that I think it's interesting is that, it's sort of become popular all the time. I think it's one of these things that's not popular in the typical seasons. When it had been, it's like, okay, it's open, it's available, it's relatively close. We feel like we can do it safely because, of course, if you're in a warmer place, you tend to be outside a lot. So we've definitely seen a lot of focus on Caribbean and Mexico in particular. And then, of course, domestic travel. Everyone's sort of talking about domestic travel. So yeah, but internationally, I think, like I said, we're looking at those kind of warm weather destinations where people know that they can get in.
One other thing I'd add here on international is, I've heard the point of view pretty frequently that will the business change materially once people come back to international travel and can choose to go somewhere else instead of doing outdoor travel? And I think what that question kind of misses a couple of points. One is that people in other countries have been cooped up for the past 2 years too and want to be outside. So, global travel is a put and a take, and there will be a lot of people coming to the US to explore some of the amazing national parks we have here, some of the amazing outdoor destinations. And, that's something that's not being really thought through in terms of what the impact is on US tourism, in addition to US travelers traveling elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think, Toby, that brings me to you as you think about, the domestic travel footprint, whether it's American travelers or international travelers coming in to enjoy the national parks, to enjoy the outdoors. This directly connects to the idea of flexibility and blending work and leisure. And I would love to know, so RVshare recent survey found that Americans really want that ability to work remotely. In fact, more than 3 in 4 say that will be a key consideration as they look to plan travel for 2022. So how do you foresee this working remotely and blending the leisure travel with the ability to actually work from an alternate destination? How do you see that impacting your business? And do you see that sticking around into 2022 and beyond?
Yes, we definitely have seen an increase in people that are working while they camp. And we consistently research that year over year, even pre-pandemic, and have seen that steadily increasing. Like I was saying earlier, we were surprised about the fall because we thought as more and more people were returning to their offices and schools were reopening, we may see things start to normalize, but that hasn't been the case. So I do think we will continue to see this trend absolutely continue into 2022. People are definitely saying they want more flexibility, and that's what's leading to a lot of the job changes, right? Those resignations or those reassessments people are making right now in their jobs. I think for it to be a lasting trend, we have to, as a camping industry, significantly address Wi-Fi on campgrounds. It's probably the thing I heard the biggest complaints about over the past year, is that people want to work remotely, and a source of frustration can be how they can access work when they're at campgrounds and on the road. Putting Wi-Fi in is probably the most difficult thing a campground owner does. It's very expensive. It's very challenging. You're bouncing around trees and RVs, and there's a lot of complexity to it, which you don't have in a hotel. So that's definitely something we're tackling, and I think the whole industry is looking at. And I think that will help this become more of a permanent or a longer trend. But we're definitely seeing it. And I think that people are enjoying that flexibility, and they're going to want to continue that.
I think that's spot on. And from RVshare's perspective, we hear the same thing as it relates to people needing Wi-Fi for their trip. When you have, 3/4 of people planning around their work schedule to travel, Wi-Fi becomes more and more important. So it is just music to my ears to hear campground providers ramping up Wi-Fi, because that's going to be how we keep people able to work remotely from outdoor destinations.
Yeah, we just had if I can just add one more thing, we just had our national convention, and my message to our franchisees was we have to think of Wi-Fi as a utility. So it's not an amenity. And if we make that mind shift, then we put the investment behind it properly. So it's, water, sewer, electric, and Wi-Fi. Those are the utilities that are part of the campground experience. And therefore we invest properly. We're really hoping that there's great technological advancements with, the satellite Wi-Fi, for example, that's being tested. I think that would help immensely, and particularly in remote locations.
As a funny story there, on April Fool's this year, we actually did a joke for the company where we announced a partnership with Starlink, where we were going to do porta potties with a Starlink satellite on top. And it was like this really funny out there thing. And the reaction from the team shocked me. Everyone was like, oh, thank God. So we might need to make that a real thing actually in 2022.
I think that would potentially win some innovation awards, but I'd certainly, whatever it takes, I guess, is what I'm sure a lot of travelers are thinking. But Jeff, let me ask you about this idea of working remotely and the flexibility that comes with it. When you think about the brands under the Expedia umbrella that you mentioned before, how important is this ability to work remotely and the flexibility that it offers, how does that impact travelers' mentalities when they're planning travel, when they're making those reservations, whether they're looking at a boutique hotel, a brand name hotel, or potentially a vacation rental that may or may not offer that reliability?
Yeah, I don't think that I think the major change is actually on people's mindset of when and how they're willing to work, more so than the ability to work in our variety of accommodation types. And so you've seen innovation. A lot of the hotels and resorts started changing their layouts and even offering day passes and different types of approaches to where you could work outside of the hotel room in a way that gave you more structured space, or even access resort amenities when you were staying at a Vrbo, so that your kids could have different type of pool experience or even childcare. And so I think there's going to be innovation across the board. From a traveler standpoint, I think the biggest change is what used to be a more discrete 2-day occasion is really jumping into some of the occasions that Alyssa mentioned. And so you'll see a 2-day weekend turn into a 4-day weekend. You might see a 4-day weekend turn into a 9-day flexcation, and really start to give people the flexibility to, work 5 hours a day here, maybe pick it up again, but be in a new place, be with their family, and have that flexibility. It'll probably be a little bit less than in the past because, really families with children aren't going to have the same flexibility in the future that they had in the past on some of these topics, even if the workplaces continue to accommodate it.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask Jeff, just because you mentioned flexcation and I've heard bleisure as another, do you think some of these buzzwords are going to stick around, or is it just going to become kind of the normal operating mentality where there is going to be this natural blend or extension of these trips where there are some of these blurred lines between working, traveling for work and or, working while traveling?
I don't think it's going to become. I don't think it's going to be buzzwordy so much as it is going to be normal. And I think primarily because I have no idea where Toby is, because you get used to the Zoom dynamic of being able to have a background and being able to use that from different spots. And as long as you're effective and productive, you can do that from anywhere in the world. And I think that's the new norm that really enables a lot of the opportunity for people to work from flexible locations.
And Alyssa, I want to come to you with this next question because Laura hit on this idea of seasonality becoming a little bit less of a thing. So with this flexibility of working, you're potentially seeing travelers being able to visit places outside of what would traditionally be considered a high season. Have you seen this impact on your business? Do you expect seasonality to undergo further shifts in 2022 and beyond?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a bit of a shift there. But to be honest, the bigger shift is like the weekday seasonality that I talked about earlier, where within a given week, there's more of a shift of people, taking that Wednesday, Thursday trip. We have seen a bit of a rise on kind of more of this like winter outdoors trip, but I think the weather is still the weather. And so in a lot of our regions currently, that's still, the less attractive time to get out there.
These stats are pretty impossible to ignore, though, on how many people are able to do this. It's more than half of people now, 55% in our survey, say they have the capability to work remotely. 40% of people say that they have more flexibility in their work schedule now than they did pre-pandemic. So, I think this manifests itself in a number of ways. I think, the great example for this is fall foliage was kind of underserved because it was in an off season from a travel perspective. It doesn't have to be if schedules are flexible or more flexible. So you will see more off-peak travel, and a lot of places are better seen off-peak. So I think that's actually really exciting for the travel industry. I think there's another impact of this, which, and I know this is probably not short-term true, but maybe long-term true, is that flexible work schedules and flexible where you can be are likely to extend careers and make people want to work longer and make people, be able to do some of the things that were on their retirement bucket list while they're still working in a flexible way.
And Laura, speaking of destiny, I think that's a really interesting point that Jon brings up, this idea that what may have been not as in demand before because of restraints from working and school schedules are all of a sudden becoming, more accessible to an everyday traveler. So are you seeing that in some of the destinations that Lonely Planet readers are interested in? And do you see any unexpected or under the radar destinations becoming much more to the forefront of travelers' minds as we move into 2022?
Well, I think the thing that's really interesting is that, in 2020 and through 2021, everyone is looking for that sort of national park, outdoors, vacation that's going to let them have a lot of space and see a lot of really beautiful nature. And I think for a lot of American travelers, the idea of that was kind of like 2 or 3 places, right? It was like the Grand Canyon, or it was Yosemite, or it was like Arches National Park. And I think the definition of that has really broadened. I think we're talking about state parks. I think we're talking about beaches. I think we're talking about things that are not necessarily like you need to go all the way across the country to see it. I think that people are looking at travel that is a lot more kind of in their backyard and is like, what are the interesting things that are right here? And there may be opportunities to get outside, go hiking, see a waterfall. It doesn't necessarily need to be like that one picture of the Grand Canyon that everyone is taking, although that's great too. But I think that people are starting to discover that there's a lot more outdoors that's a lot closer to them, which I think is really interesting. I mean, the other thing that I think is interesting is that there has been this real sweet spot around American cities. So in 2020, during the pandemic, of course, travel, you didn't hear about a lot of travel of people going into New York City in 2020. That was not an easy thing to do. But now through 2021, especially in the later part of the year, you're coming to a time in New York City where the city's open. It's a little bit more accessible. And also too, all of the international travelers aren't completely back yet. So you're seeing this time in the city where it's like a little bit quieter. And I think you're seeing this in cities across the US. So I think the city vacation is in a very interesting spot right now. I think if you want to experience things in an American city when it's a little bit quieter, when the crowds aren't quite so crazy, this is potentially a good time, or has been a good time over the last couple of months.
Jeff, I'd love for you to weigh in here because an interesting Vrbo's 2022 trend report flags some up and coming destinations. And as an example, Cincinnati saw a 125% increase in demand over this past year. So obviously you have cities like New York, but then some of these smaller metropolitan areas. Are you seeing trends as you look at 2022 bookings skewing towards cities in addition to the outdoor destinations? And how does that fit in from the large cities to some of the more mid-sized under the radar cities?
Yeah, that one jumped off the page for us too. And so I think there's a couple of things going on. And so, the drive-to destination can also start to include the drive-to city, in particular when some of the flight paths aren't back and you've got a little bit more flexibility. And I think, some places like Cincinnati, or maybe even something like a Fayetteville, benefited from being a place that is a city that actually also has a lot of outdoor access. And so you can get a little bit of the best of both worlds. And even Austin probably feels like it's in that type of category as well. And so I think that's one of the dynamics that's there. I think that anytime travelers visit a place, have a good experience and get good value, there's, likelihood that it's going to be more durable. And at the same time, like, Cincinnati is not a substitute for Manhattan or Las Vegas. And so, if that's the type of trip you're trying to take, then it doesn't really fall into the same category, but it may be a supplemental trip in a way to where I do think a lot of people are going to travel more in the future because they've gotten comfortable or excited about some destinations they hadn't visited before.
Yeah, I like to joke around. I've had a lot of trips that I personally have taken where the response when I tell people that I'm going there is like, but why? And they wind up being these incredible destinations that were under the radar and that were spots that I wouldn't have necessarily considered before. And a lot of these involve, we mentioned national parks before, but there are many other under the radar national parks, state parks, national monuments. So Jon, I'd love for you to weigh in on, do you see trends that are indicating that national parks and state parks and other outdoor areas are continuing to really resonate with travelers as they plan their 2022 trips with RVshare?
Absolutely. So I would say first on the kind of under the radar point, the biggest one for us this past year was Alaska. Alaska more than doubled year over year. And, that's one I think that experienced some of the same issues that Jeff was talking about where, the flight paths were different. There weren't as many cruises to Alaska. So people substituted those vacation types for RV vacations. had a great time, and will likely return given the satisfaction scores that we see around them. We also saw, this year people use RVs differently, using them for music festivals, using them for, like NASCAR events and things like that, having them rented, delivered to where they were going to stay, and they just kind of walk up and have their flexible accommodation wherever they want it to be. As it relates to national parks, they've long been the kind of bread and butter of the RV renting market. It's where people from all over come to rent an RV to take out into a national park. We expect that demand to be, really high next year, like it always is in our business. I mentioned the stat earlier, but over half of people are looking for an outdoor destination or a national park next year. Also, when we ask travelers, over half of them are saying that having a national park or a state park near where they're going is an important consideration for why they chose that itinerary. So we do expect them to be a big part of how outdoor travel works. They're kind of the pillars that sit alongside outdoor travel and kind of helped get it to where it's been. And now, as we mentioned, there's a bunch more markets that have come into place.
And you mentioned the idea of national parks obviously being a key draw as, part of the destination. But of course, the type of accommodations also plays a key role. So Alyssa, I'd love for you to weigh in here. In this trend report from RVshare, the appeal of RV and motorhomes rose significantly. Interest in glamping sites was up 17% since 2020. Vrbo's trend report found that chalets experienced an 85% increase in booking. So what do you think is behind travelers looking for these kinds of, we'll call them alternative accommodations outside of the traditional hotel stay? And how do you see that continuing to either change or adjust in the years to come?
I think this is a continuation of a really big long-term paradigm shift. I think you're seeing consumers move away, hopefully, from wanting to consume so many items and instead want to have meaningful, unique, and memorable experiences. And I think the travel and outdoors industries are positioned beautifully to continue to benefit from this as it continues in decades and decades to come. So I think the entire success of our company so far has been kind of predicated upon this interest in really exploring new things. I do give a lot of credit to social media here. I know social media has done plenty of bad over the last decade, and I think it's also done plenty of good. I think when people see, I love the chalet data point from Vrbo, because people probably didn't think chalets were an option, a decade ago. And I know we've seen just a tremendous amount of interest in, tree houses. Oh my gosh, we could add 1 million tree houses and they would still all be booked out all the time. I'm sure of it. So I think, having that just desire for those memorable experiences, for that, unique experience you can't easily find somewhere else. I think that's just where consumers are going to want to go, and again and again and again.
And I think a lot of this is also connected to demographics in terms of what different populations are looking at, what really makes the most sense and would mean the most to them when they're taking to the road. So Toby, I'd love for you to weigh in on if you're seeing any demographic shifts over the past year, and as you look forward to 2022 related to campgrounds, who's booking them and what they're looking for as they're planning their trips.
We've seen a sizable shift towards younger, more diverse campers over the past, I would say, 5 to 7 years, even pre-pandemic hitting. But in this past couple of years, even more so. That's largely driven by new campers, which we estimate that there's been 14 million new households started camping for the first time between last year and this year. And within that, 58% of those households are Gen Z or millennial. So when I started at KOA 11 years ago, this was largely a Caucasian baby boomer retiree activity. And now we're seeing, almost 60% of campers are under 40. And we're also seeing that 62% of new campers last year, or this year in 2021, are from non-white groups, 62%. And that's been the biggest change we've seen. So that does force our industry to really rethink who's coming to our parks and how do we best serve these customers and increase access to the outdoors and make sure that everybody's welcome at our parks and has access to those parks. We've done a lot of research around different demographic groups, underrepresented communities, different age groups. You know, for example, right now we're really digging into Gen Z. We've been talking about millennials for the past 4 or 5 years. Now we're trying to understand Gen Z, because Gen Z is definitely this new entrant that we need to be thinking about. And there's a lot of changes there. You cannot assume that a Gen Z camper wants the same things as a millennial camper. You know, we know they're, you know, digital natives for sure. So how we interact with them is different. They actually spend more conservatively. They do heavily rely on reviews from social media when making purchase decisions. They're very politically progressive, which isn't too big of a surprise. Care about social issues, care about diversity. So all those things combined just helps us think about our offerings and how we accommodate the interests and needs of these changing demographics.
And Laura, when you think about destinations and some of these younger generations trying to decide where they want to travel, what type of experiences they want to have there, what are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of interest from these younger generations as they look at planning trips for the next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we're hearing a lot about right now for that demographic in particular is this idea of slow travel. So this idea of, you know, I think there is this this kind of more old-fashioned backpacker ethos where it was like, we're going to go to 26 countries in 25 days. And I think that younger travelers are a lot less interested in that. And they're sort of like, we want to settle down in a couple of places. We want to really have really great experiences here. We want to take in nature. We want to understand the local arts and culture. We want to feel like we are giving something back to this place that we're visiting, not just visiting this place and being extractive and taking something away when we visit. So these are just a couple of things that we really hear, particularly with Gen Z. It's a little bit different than what's come before, but I think this idea of speed and taking time to really have an experience in a destination is something that is really resonating for us. It's really changing the way that we think about this idea of backpacking, quote unquote.
And yeah,
something we see there, just to jump in, that is one of the most exciting trends, I think, is especially amongst our youngest customers, very similar to this slow travel trend. They care about their carbon footprint. They want to talk about how far they're traveling, not just from a convenience and time standpoint, but from a, we know that what we're doing to this planet's ecosystems is unsustainable, and we want to be part of the solution, not the problem, but still have fun. And that awareness, I think, is something that if we fast forward, you know, let's talk about what 2030 or 2040 is going to look like. I can't imagine that's not one of the big dominant thoughts on your average consumer's mind. And again, I think the outdoor world is so well positioned to create, you know, both economic growth, but also in a way that is supportive of a healthy ecosystem on Earth that can support life. And so we're seeing more people start to turn on to that idea and actually prioritize it in their decision making.
There are clearly a lot of demographic shifts going on in outdoor travel at the moment, but one of the things that we've seen stay consistent across demographics is that this is a category of family travel. In our survey this year, 81% of travelers reported that they're excited about traveling with family, and that reaches across all demographics. This is still very much a category of family travel.
Yeah, and I think the family travel angle, obviously I have a 7-year-old daughter, and we've definitely prioritized, you know, spending time together as a family and looking for places that would be welcoming. And I do think the carbon footprint piece that Alyssa brought up is really critical as travelers continue to look at destinations. And this idea of experience, I think, also connects to some festivals, events. Things are now starting to come back. We went through a year, some cases, you know, close to 2 of, you know, very limited opportunities for these experiences at events. And Jon, I'd love for you to weigh in. People are looking to potentially book RVs to be able to enjoy some of these festivals and some of these events that are coming back. Do you see that continuing to be an even more important element of planning travel and specifically using RVs?
Absolutely. We're very excited about the idea of, festivals returning across the board. Most people, when they think of RVs, think of them as a tool for road tripping or seeing a national park. They're obviously great for that. But another thing that they are is a very flexible form of accommodation. So, through RVshare, if you're going to a music festival, you can rent an RV, have it delivered to the music festival and, show up, walk right in and have where you're going to stay be just feet away from where you want to go. And we think that's a really compelling value proposition and one that has worked really well for us. Festivals have long been big for RVshare. Our biggest individual booking event for each of the last several years leading into the pandemic was Burning Man. And it, hasn't happened each of the last 2 years. So, we're excited for events like that to return because they're great for RV travel. And events like that are also kind of get people into the idea of RV travel. People might not think themselves to be an RV traveler. Then they stay at an RV at a music festival and are like, wow, this is really cool. This would work really well for a road trip. And then they try a trip like that. So it's important for retention of new people that you're bringing into the category. And it's a meaningful bookings driver for us. So yes, we are very happy to have festivals, hopefully back in 2022.
We have a few questions coming in. I have just one more that I'm going to go through with the panel. If you haven't already done so and you're attending the session, please submit any questions you have for our panelists into the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar panel. Jeff, my last question is for you, and this is around online purchase behavior. So as customers are looking to planning travel, have you noticed any trends in terms of how they're searching, how they're discovering potentially new services or new options that they have as they're looking at planning trips in 2022?
I think because a lot of people are trying new places, whether that's a destination or even accommodation type, you're seeing, frankly, a lot more direct traffic, and it's driven by referrals. And so you see a lot of people who are in the place of, I have never been to Cincinnati or Fayetteville or to a local state park. And they ask their friend, who has stayed in a home near there or who has camped near there or who has taken an RV. And so there's more of a referral dynamic. So where we've seen that the most, Vrbo has a product called trip boards where you plan your trip together with people who are going to a house, and you can, vote on and comment on 5, 6, 7 different houses, and you invite the people who are traveling with you to participate. And that feature has seen huge uptick during the pandemic. We think largely because there's kind of like a power user who knows the category or destination well, but they're bringing, multiple generations or groups of friends and introducing them to the experience that way.
Yeah, I think the idea of planning things together and leveraging some of the opinions and advice and reviews that are out there, I think is a key element and is something that I certainly think will continue. A lot of great conversation. We do have some questions coming through that I want to make sure that we get to. We talked before about families and family travel. We've seen trends and interest not just in traveling with your nuclear family, but extended family trips, reuniting after in some cases a year, 18 months apart. So Toby, I'd love for you to weigh in on what you're seeing from a campground perspective in terms of what families are looking for and what steps you're taking to really catering to those kinds of trips in 2022.
You're absolutely right. This is definitely a family travel market. As John said, we are seeing multi-generation travel. We're seeing skip gen travel with grandparents, with grandkids, lots of family reunions happening again at campgrounds. I always like to go and look at social media and see what people are talking about. They're just talking about reuniting, and campgrounds provide nice outdoor locations to do that. They can recreate responsibly and safely. Things people are looking for is unique experiences like we've been talking about. I think that's driven the rise of some unique accommodations. So, at KOAs, we've got deluxe cabins. So people who may not want to sleep in a tent and have more of a comforts that they expect in a hotel are gravitating towards cabins. But we're also seeing, Alyssa mentioned tree houses. We're seeing tree houses, we're seeing yurts, a variety of glamping accommodations coming into traditional campgrounds. And that's largely driven by this new family market that's looking for unique experiences. We talked about technology that has to be a natural integration when you're talking about front country camping, back country, not necessarily, but front country camping like ours, private campgrounds. because people are, we do hear people say, our kids are disconnected, this is great, but when they want their kids to be connected, we need to make sure we've got proper technology. But all in, just people are coming in a variety of ways. We're seeing sites co-located, cabins next to RV sites, near tent sites, because everybody in the family is coming in differently, and we want to be able to accommodate that.
And I'm glad you mentioned the idea of technology, because there's another element here, and we have a question coming through about customer interaction and technology potentially enabling contactless interactions. So Jon, I'd love for you to weigh in here about no contact check-in, things like booking a campsite, vacation rental, an RV without ever actually talking to a person. Do you foresee this continuing? And do you think it's setting a new precedent for what customers should expect as they are booking travel in future years?
Absolutely. I think the onus is on us as providers of information to potential travelers to improve the information that we're offering to them that gives a customer everything they need to make a booking. So I think that's the big what we need to do with it. In the RV business, we've seen contactless was important right at the beginning of the pandemic. We pushed videos and things like that at the beginning of it. That's kind of backed off. And I think it's more important in other industries where it's less of a, when you rent an RV, you have to do a test drive with the owner. You have to learn how to operate it. You're typically driving a vehicle that's larger than what you usually drive. So it's important that there, is some contact, though you can socially distance and all those types of things. So it's a little bit slower in our industry. Where we have seen kind of something that's in the vein of contactless is around instant bookable inventory. There has long been demand in travel for instantly bookable inventory. We're seeing the percentage of our bookings or the increase in bookings that are instantly bookable RVs get kind of going up over time as people want inventory that's easy to secure.
Yeah, and the instantly confirmable, I think, also gets to the idea of booking windows. And we talked a little bit before about how those have potentially shifted. So Jeff, I'd love for you to weigh in. During the pandemic, we saw, in many cases, shorter booking windows, last minute travel. Do you think that's something that's going to continue, especially as we look at ongoing changing restrictions in some cases where you get just a week or even days of notice of potential change in policies? Do you think those booking windows are permanently going to be shorter, or do you think they'll ultimately regulate back to where we were pre-pandemic?
I don't think they're permanently shorter. No. Coming out of the news of the last week, we may see a little bit more like the recent history as opposed to the long-term history. But I think there's enough people in the world who want some certainty on when they're going where. And like to have things planned, that you're not going to live in this always last minute type of moment. I think people will be more comfortable with it because they've been able to have experiences and categories that maybe they used to think required, more of a long-term planning mindset. But I expect it to start to even out over the longer horizon.
And if I could jump in there, one thing I'm seeing on campgrounds right now, over half of our campers are booking 6 weeks out. It's definitely been shifting to a longer booking window. And I think that's being driven largely because campgrounds are very, very full. So many people are camping. That's definitely putting capacity constraints on parks. And so campers are learning very quickly. Even these road warriors that want to have flexibility and the freedom of the road, they know they need to plan ahead where they're going because sites just might not be available. So we're definitely seeing those booking windows increase again.
Booking windows are a function of planning to some extent, but they're also a function of supply and demand. And in almost all of our businesses, we're heavily over demanded at the moment. So that's going to lengthen booking windows. At RVshare, our booking windows are basically at pre-pandemic levels at this point. And so I don't expect the short booking windows to be something that lasts.
One of the other questions we have coming through is about the idea of if someone is going to forego taking a flight and some of the normal expenses that might go along, if they're staying closer to home, vacationing nearer to their home. Alyssa, are you foreseeing consumers spending more, opting for a higher luxury product, a more expensive product, a higher end product, since they maybe have defrayed or taken away some typical costs of vacation as they're trying to plan their trips?
Yeah, we are. I don't know if I would call it luxury, but we are definitely seeing a meaningful increase in how much people spend with us. One of the main drivers is that more and more of our partners are offering what we call add-ons or extras or experiences. So that could be as simple as like eggs and some fresh produce when you check in, because about half of Hipcamps are, working farms or ranches, but goes all the way up to like an incredible, 7-course meal or like a yoga class or massage and body work or something. So we're definitely seeing more people kind of splurge on themselves, probably because the overall cost per night is much lower than if you were to stay in a big hotel and have to pay for flights and restaurants out. And that's, I think an exciting trend. And also to our Gen Z point earlier, the other cool thing we're seeing in alignment with the slow travel aspect is more interest in where is this money going? Who am I supporting? Like what future economy am I building? And I think one of the really, powerful things about Hipcamp is when you're spending that money, it's going straight back in the hands of landowners, often small farmers and ranchers, who are then in turn being able to, take better care of their land and protect more habitat. I think all outdoor recreation does that to some extent. So we've seen more and more interest in that, which I think makes people a little more excited to spend more cash as well.
I think this is an interesting question, and I expected it to be the case that people would spend a lot more because they had a travel budget. They weren't applying flights to it, so they were able to spend more on accommodations. The stats don't bear it out for us. We've seen an increase, but it's not a huge increase in average nightly rate. And I think it's because we have two things working against each other here. One is the kind of classic leisure travelers are potentially booking a nicer RV and taking it out, but you also have the flexible work group who's trying to optimize for value and get a longer trip for their same travel budget. So that's pulling the number down. So those two things kind of working in parallel are netting out for a small increase in average nightly rate, but not much more than that.
I also think there's still so much economic uncertainty right now. I forget the exact stat, but if you look it up, the amount of savings that Americans are currently sitting on is at unprecedented levels. So people are kind of sitting there with their money, waiting for the world to turn back on, wondering, when that's going to happen and when they're going to feel comfortable spending. So it's possible we're going to see a lot more of this specific trend in the future.
And Laura, as you think about travelers picking destinations, how influenced do you think they will be by spending habits, the amount that it will cost them to get there, what it will cost them to be there? Do you think there will be a bigger emphasis on so-called bargain destinations where they can stay for longer and potentially work remotely? Or do you think there will be a prioritization of destinations where they can spend a little bit more splurge because they're sitting on a chunk of points and miles or cash that they've accumulated over the last 18 months?
I think the thing that we're seeing is yes to all of the above. I think that we're seeing that a single traveler is actually interested in both of those things, sometimes in the same trip. So they're going to be sort of adjusting across a single trip where they're going to spend, they've decided that they love food. So that's going to be the place where they're really going to splurge on this trip. And that means that, they're going to stay in a place that's like a little, like they're not going to stay in a super high-end lodging because they have other priorities with their budgets. And the thing that we're seeing is that there's really this idea of the definition of the luxury traveler is really changing, where we're seeing it's much more mix and match. So you can have really luxury elements on your trip. Like I want to stay in, the most beautiful high-end glamping yurt that you've ever seen. And then you'll save on other aspects of the trip. So this is something that I think is really just changing in terms of the way that we think about travelers. It doesn't mean that you're going to go sort of luxury everything beginning to end. We're seeing that people are really following their interests, investing more in what they're really interested in. Like I said, whether it's, cultural activities or whether it is, a beautiful place to stay or it's food or, something like that. And they're saving in other areas. So like I said, I think we're seeing a really kind of interesting mix and match happening right now.
I think that's certainly a very good spot to, wrap up our Q&A here. I would like to leave the last few minutes here and allow each one of our panelists to, provide any wrap-up thoughts that they have. We'll go in order as well. So I went through today. So let's start, Toby, with you. Any final thoughts on overall trends as you look ahead to 2022, specifically for KOA, for campgrounds, and for the travel industry at large?
Sure. One thing I didn't mention today, we didn't get to, is this emergence of EV and its impact on travel. So definitely electric vehicles are on the road, electric RVs are right around the corner. So that's a big focus for us heading into 2022, is being able to accommodate electric vehicles and electric RVs. So we just have a new partnership announced with Jamestown that's putting in, chargers at all, superchargers at all of our campgrounds. So, the campgrounds can purchase those. We're also working on how we integrate that into the site. I think that, we talked about Gen Z being curious and interested in sustainability. And I think that's the next big thing, solar integration. How do we handle EV, water reclamation? Lots of things like that is where we're headed next. That could be a whole other panel discussion. There's a lot of fun stuff there.
Yeah, that'll be our 2022 panel as we look forward. So we'll make sure to bring you back for that. Jon, what about you? Any final wrap-up thoughts around trends as you look ahead to 2022 at RVshare?
Yeah, I just say, RV travel and outdoor travel have proven over the course of the pandemic that they're for everyone. You look at some of our trend reporting, 70% of millennials are interested in taking an RV trip. It's over 50% of Gen X is interested in taking an RV trip. It really, spans generations, it spans demographics, and it's really a type of travel that is kind of here to stay and is for everyone. This, and I mentioned this several times, but I think it's the big point in all of this, is as work becomes more flexible, travel becomes different. It becomes more frequent, it becomes more blended, and it becomes something that's a bigger budget item for people. So that is something that us as a travel industry, and specifically as an outdoor travel industry, can really benefit from.
Jeff, what about you? Any final thoughts from Expedia in terms of trends looking ahead at 2022?
I think the biggest uncovered or not discussed topic today was really how adaptable the air industry is proving in this moment. And so if you think about all of the new routes that have come online, potentially there's fewer routes to a Chicago or a London or a New York, but I live in Austin, Texas. We've got routes to the Bahamas, to Boise, Idaho, to Taos, to Aspen, to Costa Rica, 3 dailies to Hawaii. And so just don't underestimate how flexible they can be in actually helping to promote and drive the type of tourism that we've been calling drive to, but is actually a different type of occasion. I met a family on our recent trip who flew to Denver, rented an RV, had a house near Arches, and was driving to stay in a resort in Vegas. And like those types of occasions are going to be more and more common because the air industry is going to help make it possible.
Yeah, one of the destinations that saw a huge increase in service during the pandemic was Palm Springs. You think about Coachella coming back on, Joshua Tree National Park right there. So I think that's certainly a great point from what we've seen from the major carriers. Alyssa, same question to you. Any final thoughts on trends as you're looking forward to 2022 from Hipcamp?
I think the outdoors has officially become mainstream. I think we've had that tipping point and we're in a new world. I think our culture has shifted in such drastic and dramatic ways in the past 2 years that it's hard to really even reconnect with where we all were just a couple falls ago. And I think one of the big changes is, the outdoors is mainstream now. It's front and center for everyone, which is going to have many interesting impacts. And then again, specifically, this is something very personal and near and dear to my heart, but again, something we see in our customer surveys coming up, the rising awareness of climate change and biodiversity crises really becoming front and center as people decide what they want to spend their money and time on is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. I think with COP26 this year, you saw biodiversity being talked about on the same stage as climate change for the first time, and that was a huge deal. And I think especially these younger customers, they're paying attention, they know what's going on, and again, they want to figure out how to be part of the solution. And not the problem, and they still want to have fun. And so I think that's just a early trend, but when we look forward to a decade or two from now, I think that's going to just continue to transform how people travel.
And Laura, finally, ending with you, any thoughts from Lonely Planet's perspective as you're looking ahead at trends for 2022 and beyond?
Yeah, I think that 2020 and 2021 added a lot of friction to the travel process. And I think that all of that has made people really think about how they want to travel differently in the future. And what does travel mean in terms of connecting yourself to the world and reaching out to people and having an incredibly important personal life-changing experience. So not just about visiting a destination and checking it off your list. Like, this is about having experiences and having it be really connected to your personal identity and what you say about yourself. And I think that that's all really come into focus in light of the pandemic. So I think these are going to be the themes that we're going to see going through travel and vacation planning well into the future.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it as we look ahead to 2022. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to our panelists, Toby O'Rourke from KOA, Jon Gray from RVshare, Jeff Hurst from Expedia, Alyssa Ravasio from Hipcamp, and Laura Motta from Lonely Planet. Some really great topics that we covered today. We really appreciate you all attending. Hope you have a great rest of the week and a happy early holidays.
Thank you.